She had never been the kind of person people noticed. In a world where loud voices and bold personalities dominated, she was content staying in the background, watching rather than speaking, understanding rather than being understood. Life had taught her that it was safer that way. Being overlooked meant not being judged, not being challenged, not being hurt. But everything changed the day she decided she was done being invisible. It wasn't one moment that sparked the change, but rather a series of them, small, quiet realizations that built up over time until they could no longer be ignored. She had spent years playing by the rules, doing what was expected, and keeping her dreams small because that was what everyone around her did. But one day, she looked in the mirror and saw a girl who had been waiting for permission, waiting for someone else to believe in her, waiting for a life she had never even dared to ask for. And she decided that waiting wasn't enough. The first step was the hardest. People didn't take her seriously at first. They smiled politely, amused by the idea that she, of all people, thought she could step into a world that wasn't made for people like her. She wasn't from the right family, didn't have the right connections, didn't fit the image of someone who changed the rules. But that only fueled her determination. She didn't speak much, but when she did, people started listening. There was something about her that made them pause, not just the words she said, but the way she said them. Quiet confidence, unshakable certainty. It was unnerving at first, this realization that she had a voice, that she had something to say. But once she found her rhythm, there was no stopping her. She didn't wait for doors to open for her. She built her own. She walked into rooms where she didn't belong and refused to leave. She challenged traditions that had gone unquestioned for too long. And slowly, the world around her started to shift. People began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she was onto something. But not everyone was impressed. Change was uncomfortable, especially for those who had always been in control. The more she grew, the more resistance she faced. Some tried to undermine her, to remind her of who she used to be, to convince her that she was stepping too far out of line. Others whispered that she was getting ahead of herself, that she didn't know what she was doing, that she was destined to fail. And for a moment, she almost believed them. Doubt crept in, whispering the same fears she had carried for years. What if they were right? What if she was just pretending to be something she wasn't? What if she was making a mistake? But then she remembered. She remembered the girl she used to be, the one who was too afraid to take up space, who shrank herself to fit into places she had long outgrown. She wasn't that girl anymore. She was just getting started, and the people who had underestimated her, they were about to see exactly what she was capable of. That moment of realization stayed with her. It wasn't just a passing thought. It became the foundation for everything she was about to do. She had spent years blending into the background, but now every step she took felt different, as if the world itself was shifting around her. People were noticing, some with curiosity, others with skepticism, but she no longer let their opinions define her. Her journey didn't start with grand gestures or bold declarations. It started with small, intentional choices. She began speaking up in conversations where she had once remained silent. When decisions were being made, she no longer nodded along. She asked questions, pushed back, made her presence known. At first, people were caught off guard. They weren't used to this version of her, and she could see it in their eyes, the uncertainty, the slight discomfort. Some embraced the change, intrigued by her newfound confidence. Others resisted it, dismissing her as someone who had suddenly become too ambitious. She could hear the whispers behind her back, the careful warnings disguised as concern. She's changed too much. She's trying too hard. She doesn't know her place anymore, but she didn't care. What they didn't realize was that she had spent years knowing her place, staying within the lines drawn for her, never questioning if those lines could be erased. Now she saw things differently. She saw possibilities where she once saw limits. She saw choices where she once felt trapped. she started pursuing things she had once only dreamed about. The idea had always been there, lingering in the back of her mind, but now she acted on it. The journey wasn't easy. She faced obstacles, at every turn people who didn't take her seriously, moments where she questioned herself, failures that made her wonder if she was making a mistake, but every time doubt crept in, she reminded herself of why she had started. She worked harder, learned faster, and refused to be discouraged by the setbacks. The more she pushed forward, the more things began to shift. She gained allies, people who saw something in her, who believed in what she was trying to do. They weren't the loudest voices in the room, but they were the ones who mattered. And then, just when it seemed like she was gaining momentum, something unexpected happened. A challenge she never saw coming, one that tested everything she had built. It wasn't just about proving herself anymore. It was about whether she had the strength to keep going when everything seemed to be working against her. She had always known that change wasn't easy. But now, she was about to learn just how much she was willing to fight for it. She felt the weight of every step she took, each one carrying her further into unknown territory. The quiet acceptance that had once defined her was gone, replaced by something stronger, something unshakable. But with every move she made, resistance followed. It wasn't just the whispers anymore, there were roadblocks now, deliberate attempts to slow her down, to remind her that change wasn't welcome everywhere. It started subtly at first. Promises that were once certain suddenly became uncertain. Meetings where she should have been included conveniently left her out. People who had once smiled at her now looked away. She could sense it all, but she refused to back down. Instead, she worked harder, found new ways to push forward, refusing to let anyone silence her progress. But then, the opposition became louder. The quiet disapproval turned into direct confrontation. Some questioned her intentions, twisting her words to fit their narratives. Others doubted her abilities, making it clear that they didn't believe she deserved a place at the table. She expected resistance, but she hadn't expected how exhausting it would be to constantly prove herself. She wasn't alone, though. There were those who saw the fire in her, who recognized what she was trying to do. Some stood beside her openly, while others supported her from the sidelines, careful not to draw attention to themselves. Even the ones who didn't speak up gave her silent encouragement, a nod, a glance, a moment of understanding when no words were needed. Among them was someone she hadn't expected. At first, their paths had only crossed in fleeting moments, brief encounters that never seemed to mean much. But now, they kept finding each other, their conversations growing longer, more intense. There was something in the way they listened, the way they asked the right questions, the way they challenged her, but never dismissed her. It was different from anything she had known before. But just as she started to believe she had found an ally, doubt crept in. Was their support genuine, or was it just another test? She had learned the hard way that not everyone who stood beside her was truly on her side. Trust was a fragile thing, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to give it so easily. Meanwhile, outside forces continued to tighten around her. A decision was approaching, one that would determine everything she had been working toward. The opposition was growing bolder, determined to make sure she failed. And yet, she felt something else rising inside her, something stronger than fear, something that told her she wasn't done fighting. But the real question wasn't whether she was ready for what was coming next. It was whether the people around her were, because once the next move was made, there would be no going back. The pressure was mounting, and she could feel it in every interaction, every conversation that carried unspoken warnings. The people who had once dismissed her were now watching closely, waiting for her to make a mistake. Some had even started planting doubts in places they knew would hurt the most. Whispers reached her ears, claims that she had changed too much, that she had forgotten where she came from, that her ambitions had made her blind to the realities of those around her. But she knew better. She hadn't forgotten anything. If anything, she was seeing things more clearly than ever before. The way certain people held power, the way systems were designed to keep things exactly as they were, she understood it now. And that understanding made her dangerous to them. The one person she thought she could trust was beginning to act differently. Their support had once felt unwavering, but now there were hesitations, careful pauses before they spoke, a distance that hadn't been there before. She wanted to believe it was just the weight of everything happening around them, but deep down, she feared something else. Had they been convinced to turn against her? Or had they never been on her side to begin with? Then came the moment she had been anticipating, the opportunity that could change everything. It was bigger than she had expected, more public, more decisive. The stakes weren't just high, they were personal. If she failed, it wouldn't just be her dream that suffered, it would be everything she had fought for, every person who had dared to believe in her. And of course, they were ready for her. The ones who wanted to see her fall had been preparing, making sure every possible obstacle was in place. They didn't just want to stop her, they wanted to break her spirit, to make sure she never tried again. But what they didn't understand was that she had already made up her mind. No matter how much they tried to intimidate her, she wasn't going to back down. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to walk away now. The moment of decision was coming fast, and when it arrived, she knew she had to be ready. Because once she stepped forward, there would be no room for hesitation. Just when she thought she had prepared for every possibility, something happened that she never saw coming. It wasn't an open attack, not the kind of confrontation she had been bracing for. No, this was different, subtle, quiet, and far more dangerous. It started with a message, one that wasn't meant for her, but somehow ended up in her hands. A name she recognized, a conversation she shouldn't have seen. At first, she thought it was a mistake, some kind of misunderstanding. But as she read through the words, the truth became undeniable. Someone close to her, someone she had trusted, was involved in something bigger than she had realized. Her heart pounded as she pieced it together. This wasn't just about her breaking barriers or defying expectations. There were deeper interests at play, people who had been watching her long before she even knew she was a threat to them. And now, they had made their move. She couldn't ignore it, couldn't pretend she hadn't seen what she saw. But confronting it, head-on, wasn't an option, not yet. She needed to be smart, to understand what was really going on before she acted. Because if she exposed them without proof, they would turn it against her. They would make her look paranoid, reckless, maybe even desperate. So she did the only thing she could. She played along, pretending she didn't know, watching closely as the people around her continued their games. She listened more, spoke less, paid attention to the smallest shifts in behavior. And as she did, she started to see the full picture. This wasn't just about stopping her, it was about controlling her. They didn't just want her to fail, they wanted her to willingly step aside, to doubt herself, to believe that maybe she wasn't meant to change the rules after all. They wanted her to give up before she even reached the finish line. But they had underestimated her, because if they thought she would break, they didn't understand what had built her in the first place. The sacrifices, the struggles, the years of being overlooked, those had made her stronger, not weaker. And now, with the truth in front of her, she knew exactly what she had to do. The game had changed again. But this time, she was the one setting the rules. She had spent weeks piecing everything together, quietly observing, pretending not to know the truth, while preparing for the moment she would strike back. The message she had received wasn't a mistake, it was a warning. Someone had wanted her to see it, to realize what she was up against. But instead of retreating, she had done the opposite. She had followed every lead, connected every detail, and now, standing at the edge of the biggest moment of her life, she was ready. The night of the event arrived, a grand celebration that was meant to be a turning point for everyone involved. Important names filled the room, the very people who had underestimated her, who had worked behind the scenes to push her out. They smiled, unaware of what was coming. She moved through the crowd effortlessly, her confidence unshaken, her presence undeniable. If they had hoped to intimidate her, they had failed then. Just as the speeches began, she made her move, a quiet signal to someone she trusted, and within seconds, the room shifted. A screen lit up, displaying conversations and evidence that had been hidden until now. Gasps filled the air as people turned to look at each other, whispers growing louder with every passing moment. The truth was out, but just when she thought she had control of the moment, something unexpected happened. A voice spoke up, calm but firm, and she turned to see someone she had trusted standing in the middle of the chaos. The betrayal was clear in their eyes before they even said the words. They had been playing both sides, feeding her information while working against her the entire time. For a brief moment, the room felt like it was closing in, the weight of everything threatening to crash down on her. But she had come too far to stop now. With a deep breath, she turned the situation back in her favor, exposing the final piece of truth she had been holding back, the final twist that no one had seen coming. The tension reached its peak as the weight of the revelation settled over everyone. Some scrambled to cover their tracks, others stood frozen, knowing there was no escaping the truth anymore. And she, the woman they had tried to silence, stood at the center of it all, unshaken. As the night ended, she walked away with her head held high, knowing that she had won not just the battle, but the war. The game had been rigged from the start, but she had rewritten the rules, and now there was no going back. She stepped out into the cool night air, her heart still racing from everything that had just unfolded. The weight of the past few months had been lifted, but the reality of what came next settled in. The truth was out, the lies exposed, and yet she knew that this wasn't the end, it was the beginning of something new. People would talk. Some would admire her courage, while others would see her as a threat. But none of that mattered anymore. She had done what she came to do, and she had done it on her own terms. As she walked away from the venue, she felt the vibration of her phone in her hand. Messages were flooding in, some from those who had been waiting for this moment, others from people who were now scrambling to protect themselves. She ignored them all for now. She needed a moment to breathe, to take it all in. The city lights flickered in the distance, and she found herself drawn to a quiet spot by the water. She sat on a bench, looking out at the reflection of the skyline. It felt surreal, knowing how much had changed in just a few hours. She thought back to where she had started, just a simple girl with dreams, unaware of how brutal the world could be. She had trusted too easily, loved too deeply, and learned the hard way that not everyone had good intentions. But those lessons had shaped her, and now she was stronger than she had ever been. A familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see someone she hadn't expected, someone she thought had disappeared after everything fell apart. Their expression was unreadable, but there was something in their eyes that made her pause. Were they here to apologize? To explain? To try and change the outcome? For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then finally, they sat down beside her, exhaling slowly before speaking. They admitted the truth, not just about what had happened that night, but everything leading up to it. Their role in the deception, their regrets, and the choices they had made. It was an admission she hadn't expected, but deep down, she had always known she listened, not because she was ready to forgive, but because she needed to hear it. And when they finally stopped talking, she asked the question that had been weighing on her mind the most. Why the answer was complicated, tangled in ambition, fear, and the need to survive in a world that didn't make room for second chances. They hadn't set out to betray her, it had just become easier than standing by her side. And for that, they would have to live with the consequences. She didn't say much after that. She didn't need to. Some betrayals couldn't be undone, no matter how many words were spoken. But as she stood up to leave, she looked back once more, letting them see that she wasn't the same girl they had underestimated. She had changed, and she wasn't looking back over the next few days. The impact of that night rippled through every circle. The people who had tried to manipulate her were now scrambling to save themselves. Some tried to twist the narrative, but the truth had already taken root. There was no erasing it. She found herself at a crossroads, one path leading back to the life she had fought so hard to hold on to, and another leading to something entirely new. The choice was hers now, and for the first time, she didn't feel afraid. Opportunities came knocking, some from unexpected places, others from people who had once dismissed her. But she was careful now. She had learned that not all offers came without strings attached. So, she took her time, weighing each decision, making sure that whatever she chose next was truly hers. And then one day, she found herself standing in front of a new door, ready to step into a future she had created for herself. She wasn't just the girl they had taken for granted anymore. She was the woman who had rewritten the rules of the game. As she walked forward, she didn't look back. The past had shaped her, but it didn't define her. She was in control now, and the world would have to keep up.